My name is Brock, and this is the Dungeon Master's Toolkit podcast. On today's episode, I talk to Randy, also known as Party of Bards. We talk about designing within the Powered by the Apocalypse space, playing with emotion, diving back into D&D, and making the most of GenCon. It was a wonderful conversation, and I hope you guys enjoy. Before we jump into the episode, I just want to thank all of my listeners and give you a few ways that you can help support the podcast. The first way is just by listening to the episode, so congratulations, you're already helping me out. You can also interact with the podcast in any way, like share, all of the usual things that also greatly helps me out, and it's super easy to do. The next way you can help is by interacting with the community, hanging out in the Discord server, playing or running games on the server, or joining in our design contests that we run. The third way you can help is by being interviewed or letting somebody else know that they should get on the show. All you got to do is contact me via Discord or Twitter or wherever, and we'll get some time scheduled to get you in on an episode. If you're still looking for ways to support the show, you can always use one of the affiliate links in the show notes for any of the RPGs or books that are mentioned. They link to either Amazon or DriveThruRPG, and if you make a sale for anything on one of those sites after using a link, then I get a small percentage of the sales. That's a great way to support the show while also getting something for yourself. And finally, the last way is you can support me on Patreon or buy me a coffee. I will have links in the show notes on where to go for that. And that's just a simple monthly donation to help fund future design competitions and equipment purchases and stuff like that. Thank you again to all of my listeners. I feel like we've been growing a really awesome community here around tabletop role-playing games. And with that, let's jump into the episode. Welcome, everybody. Today I have Randy, also known as Party of Bards, here with me. Welcome, Randy.
Thank you for having me back on. It's excellent to be back.
Yes, if anybody wants to hear the first episode that I did with Randy, that is episode 10, so you can go find that in the archives and listen to it. But today we're going to talk about a couple of different topics, starting with designing within the PbtA space. So Randy, do you want to talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, absolutely. I will state up front, I would not consider myself an absolute expert, but it is something that I've been working on for the last year and learning a lot about, and I found it to be very interesting. What I would say up front, there's, if anybody is really interested in diving deep into this topic, Vincent Baker, one of the designers of the Power of the Apocalypse system, has this amazing, I think now like 8-part blog series up on the Lumply Games blog. I bet that Brock will give that into the show notes for us later on. So some of what I'll talk about, is just going to thieve directly from that, but he'll say it better than I. This was one of those things. I wanted to spin up a new campaign last summer. My friends and I had gotten to a point with vaccination and other safety standards where we felt comfortable kind of coming back together as a group again. Wanted to have a new in-person game, and I had spent, like the first year of the pandemic doing nothing but watching like really comforting, like sci fantasy, young adult focused TV, like She-Ra and Voltron and The Owl House and all that kind of stuff. So that's what was on my brain. So I wanted to tell that kind of story, something very character focused. I've run a ton of Fate. It's by far the thing I've run the most. And I wanted to go like even harder down that like narrative style of game, even more into that player-driven style of game, even more into that kind of improv-y, somewhat hands-off, low-prep GM style of game. And Power by the Apocalypse was, seemed like the best fit for all of that. So I decided to try to dive in, learn what I could. And then, me being me, I had to just make up a game rather than play anything that existed, because nothing that existed out there fit exactly what I was hoping for.
I feel like that is the curse of being a DM, is that everybody has their own tabletop game that's like in progress, whether or not it'll actually see a table or not. But I'm guilty as well of always having like a side project that you just kind of fiddle with from time to time. And Powered by the Apocalypse, the engine is so easy to tweak and do whatever you want with, which is great.
Yeah, I completely agree, and that's kind of what I found myself, doing is, the Vincent kind of describes it more as like a philosophy versus a toolkit, and I can absolutely see that. He has those like really fascinating thoughts on like PbtA as like this conversation where the real world stuff like dice is like flowing back up into the conversational stuff like the fiction, and has all these really cool graphics and stuff. But the truth of it is, a lot of people who have created PbtA games over the years have just taken the mechanics from Apocalypse World and grafted them onto other kinds of fiction. And so, I think it's, at least in the popular consciousness, may as well be a toolkit at this point. And that's kind of what I wanted to go with. And I wanted to try to, if I could, adapt that fiction I'd been consuming a lot of, sort of like as a genre of, this sort of like hopeful, like teens against the world, learning who you are, you know, lots of magic and sci-fi nonsense crammed in there as well, just for funsies. And it was one of those things, again, mid-pandemic, I was reading some article, I think on like Kotaku maybe, about the literary genre of hope punk, which is, a lot of those same ideas distilled, of even if things are bad, they can get better. People collaborating as a community to build a better world, kind of as almost like a pushback against like super grim, dark, dire kinds of stuff that maybe wasn't as pleasant to consume with the way the world, has been recently. So therefore, the game winds up with this name, Hope Punk Cosmica, just to be as on the nose about it as possible when recruiting people. And I try to be as straightforward as I could. I was like, hey, I would like to make sort of like a sci fantasy teen, magical kids high school game set amidst, a classic, intergalactic war against oppressive evil empire to be determined. Who's down for that? Who's interested in? Pulled in the people that seem like the best fit for that. With a backlog of like 15 more that I wish I could have brought in as well. And we started diving into it. And one of the first things that we kind of arrived at is that we really liked in a lot of those properties is that you would have those classic like high school movie and TV show character tropes of like the jock and like the nerd and the new kid and maybe the troubled background kid. But then you also had like all those like different like magical archetypes, like the person with fire powers and the person who's like super strong. So we ripped off a little bit from Glitter Hearts in that those would be two separate things every character could bring to bear. We would have sort of your character trope playbook, and then we would have your magical powers playbook as a bond. And I did a lot of dev work on sort of the tropey side, and then I kind of worked with each player individually to make up those magical bonds. So we wound up with some pretty wild and weird stuff that I really love. We definitely have a character who is a self-described Hugo witch. Powers of that involve a lot of like knitting needles and quilts and perfectly brewed teas and comforting vibes. But then we also have this character who is bonded to some ancient artifact that is a representation of the eternal cycle of becoming and unbecoming and resurrection, and maybe that character can't die anymore, but we're not going to worry about that too much. It's fine.
So you almost have like two pieces of your puzzle for character creation, then it sounds like, right? You have the trope, and then the so you basically can pick that independently of the magical power piece of it.
Yeah. Which again, I think Glitter Hearts did super well originally. We just wanted to kind of go a little weirder with the power side of it, I think. But I really like that notion that the stereotypical like 80s movie jock might express the struggles that come along with, say, a tech kind of character or tech power set differently than like a nerdy character necessarily would.
Sure.
And being able to tell those narrative arcs inherent to those character tropes with wildly different powers sounded like it would be a lot of fun for us to mix and match like that. So that's kind of what we went for.
It definitely opens up your possibility space of what characters can be played then too, right? Because you're not always stuck as I'm the nerd, so I'm the tech guy, or I'm the jock, so I'm the strong guy, right? So you get some more possibility space there for possible characters. Have you found any issues with like balancing or design where when you are opening up that design space, you're also introducing a lot more unknowns as far as combinations and players pulling off kind of weird stunts? Have you had any issues with that?
Oh yeah, and so that kind of brings us to the other way that I decided to go about this. You mentioned every GM's got that giant Word doc on their hard drive of the game that's going to be amazing someday that maybe doesn't hit the table. So I wanted this to hit the table. I got what felt like a pretty decent baseline. I worked with the individual players to make up playbooks that suited their visions and kind of tweaked some of my initial ideas around that. And I said, all right, let's just play this thing. Like, let's do the thing and figure it out. So, we had like a session, what I call like -1. We played sort of a world building game to construct the space that I actually mentioned a little bit back in Ep 10. And then, we had our traditional session 0 of, build out the characters, introduce them. And then we dove right in. And almost immediately as the dice hit the pavement, to mix my metaphors, yeah, we had some struggles and some issues crop up pretty quickly. One that we hit really early on, a lot of PbtA games have some kind of relationship mechanic. Whether that's influence and masks, or strings from Monster Hearts, or Thirsty Sword Lesbians. You have some kind of mechanic that's tied to how the characters feel about each other. So we went with connections, and your connections could get stronger and weaker. Which the intent was there to like show they could be positive or negative. Each player would kind of write what the connection was, and then different moves in the game could influence it going up or down. But one of the early design decisions we made was to have that aid another kind of move uh, reduce the level of a connection, kind of pull some of the points off of it to power that boost to your friend. Which everybody hated because they're like, this just feels super transactional. Like I have to weaken how strong my friendship is with her to give her a bonus. I hate that. And then, yeah, to your point, we had some characters who we realized, oh, hey, your magic powers that seem pretty balanced on their own, when we combine them with your reluctant hero trope of I can store up a big roll to just drop whenever I finally accept my role in this conflict, that, being able to have a 12 plus at any time really takes those superpowers to another level and lets you be pretty absurdly strong. So we played out about a dozen game first season, I called it, and then we took a break so that we could edit and revise and talk through all of it together and work on balance, but also work on making sure that it was kind of hitting the narrative goals and the storytelling goals.
And how many sessions have you done for playtesting?
So we are, in the midst of season 2 now, episode number question mark. We are not very far into season 2. I think we're like 2 sessions there. So we're theoretically playing twice a month from last summer. So we'll hopefully hit about 20 total sessions by this summer. And the intention is to run this for about 3 seasons, and have that classic arc of like kids at school to kids in the broader world to kids zipping around the galaxy fighting evil. So, after about 2 years, the hope is we'll have this in a pretty solid space, and then I can, throw it up on itch.io and get 3 downloads that are all from my players, and then it's never heard of again. And all of this, to be clear, is developed in tandem with one of the players and a good friend of mine online and in real life. They go by Fry. Awesome game designer, and has really helped out a lot with this. They have a lot more experience with PbtA than I do, and so being able to kind of bounce ideas off of them of like, yeah, I want to have some of that like episodic TV show type stuff, and they're like, yeah, but if you want to be telling like a more continuous story, maybe back it off like this, or great discussions on is +1 better or rolling with advantage better? Like, do we want to overwhelm people with huge numbers or keep things simple? Those back and forth conversations throughout the whole process have been really huge in shaping this thing. Just as much as the playtesting have been.
When you're going through a session, do you find yourself tweaking rules and stuff kind of on the fly, or making like new uh, rulings as things are happening, or do you kind of say, "Hey, we're going to play it as the rules are, and then when we find issues, we're going to write it down and then come back and then tweak those after the session? What is that process like?
It was almost exactly the second one. Part of it was this is brand new for a lot of us. It's my first time really seriously running PbtA and getting used to the whole like, don't roll as a GM, don't heavily prep, any kind of plotting type stuff, have basic scenarios and basic NPCs who have some objectives and maybe a move, but it's a very different style of prep. So it's new to me and new to them because I've just dumped a bunch of rules that Fry and I wrote, onto these people, a couple weeks before the game and said, we'll figure it out as we play. So there were, like I said, those pain points, the transactional connections or those weird interactions between your playbook and your bond. But we wanted to be sure, is this just us being uncomfortable because it's new? Or is this actually not working? So let's play out that first arc and really get a feel for how this thing works now. And then we'll rip the guts out and do that over again. And I don't know if one or the other is better. Definitely having to play through some of those annoyances for like 5 or 6 sessions after we were really sure that they were definitely going to be changed was maybe mildly frustrating. But then on the other hand, it's very relieving now that they're all gone.
Yeah, I was trying to think of how I would handle that, and I think I would probably lean towards that direction as well, just because if you're basically rewriting rules like at the table, then it's gonna feel like the game is almost gonna be like too fluid, in that you just for like the players, they probably just aren't gonna know like, okay, well, I'm not really sure what's happening. But then, like to your point too, if it's continuously a pain point over the course of a couple of sessions, then it probably needs to be changed. If it was just like a weird edge case or something, maybe it's not as big of a deal, so maybe you don't need to like rush to fix it until you know that this is a long-term problem for the game.
Yeah, I agree. And we did a lot of stuff, really trying to tie the playbooks back to those mechanics to make sure that the mechanics were always going to drive sort of your personal narrative arc forward. So it's one of those of like, if we change how bonuses work, everybody's playbooks are going to shift as a result of that. If we change how these connections work, each character is going to be affected in large and small ways. Like that's kind of the idea here, is that this is a game primarily about relationships. So changing that one mechanic has these huge cascading changes out for everybody. So we were definitely really cautious about, just doing it willy-nilly and then throwing everybody, off every single session. But it's one of those things. I suspect when season 3 comes around, it's going to change a lot again.
Yeah, that makes sense. The more time you get on it, the more it's going to change, and hopefully for the better. Are the playbooks set up? I've only actually played a couple of Powered by the Apocalypse games, but I've read a bunch of them. Are they set up to where each of the character or each of the playbooks has like a bunch of different moves with specific triggers? I'm assuming that's kind of the format for the playbooks.
Yeah, absolutely. So we have we give them kind of epic sounding names. We have the Preserver, which is that the mom friend might be another name for that trope. The person who's always got the bag of snacks and bandages and kind of looks out for all the other characters, is very supportive and kind. But the flip side of that is, they can give too much of themselves and sometimes not leave enough in the tank to kind of run on because they've supported everyone else so much. So yeah, that's a character that heavily, flips on a lot of support type moves, boosting other people up, clearing conditions off of them whenever they get, kind of emotionally destabilized by what's happening to them. Versus the Divided is that playbook for this genre of fiction, the classic trope of somebody who used to be on the other side who's joined your side. And so a lot of their, kind of fictional triggers are tied around whether the people they're interacting with believe in them and trust them, or if they're people who still have doubts about them and maybe aren't as forthright with them. And so it's that struggle of that deep frustration of people not trusting you. But if you let that frustration boil over, you only give them more reasons not to trust you. So we have a lot of hooks into the fiction like that, but then also they get to do cool stuff. So we have the Transformed, the person who had something really crazy happen to them and now their whole physical appearance is different. So this is a character who can, if they really kind of accept what they've become, they can really do some pretty cool stuff and like really lean into their new powers and their new abilities and shape the world around them. That preserver can just be doling out bonuses and make sure that nobody at the table has to fail as long as they're willing to kind of give enough from themselves.
It all sounds really cool. I'd be interested to actually read through some of it.
Once I finish the edits to the actual player packet for season 2, I'll pass it your way. Right now, we just have the list of stuff we wanted to change, and that's what we're technically playing out of right now, which maybe is an idea.
How are you keeping all of this? Is this just like a Word doc or?
So we have a big Google Drive that we all share. So we have sort of like the core base playbooks, and then players have kind of made copies of those to tweak them, and some of them have made some really cool like Google Sheets style playbooks that are like color coded to their personal like style and stuff like that. But then we have the core rules. Session 0, we did sort of like a lines and veils type thing, so we've got that front and center to keep that type of stuff in mind. And we have, if players have written notes or journals or letters and stuff, we keep all that. And then we have a couple of reference sheets, like single sheets that we've printed out that we can have at the table with us whenever somebody doesn't feel like scrolling through a 20-page Google Doc to search for something.
Awesome. Is there anything else you want to say on that, or do you want to jump into our next section that we have here?
Honestly, I kind of think we have a decent segue over to the next one.
So playing with emotion.
Yeah, like I mentioned, that was a big deal going into this, was being able to have characters who had really big feelings. And I really wanted to kind of pick up, again, some, not all. I'm very lucky to be in a community of friends who are really amazing role players, but I picked up at least some of the best role players I know. And I really wanted to kind of live in that space. In the previous I made a couple of references to this old campaign a lot of us were a part of called New Guard. That was one of Raleigh Tabletop RPG's semi-organized play campaigns. Those are our large multi-GM, many-player games that we run on a seasonal basis throughout the year. And New Guard was the classic Teen Titans / Young X-Men style or Young Mutant style game of like teenagers at the superhero high school learning how to be heroic. And I'm not saying that many people in the player base maybe design characters to kind of work through some lingering traumas from high school, but that wasn't uncommon. But the flip side is that it had a ton of buy-in. I think when you're able to see a little bit of yourself in your character, it's always a little easier to get into their headspace. It's not to say that's the only way to do it, but it makes it a lot easier. So we really wanted to kind of recapture some of those feelings of people being super invested, just really embodying those characters. So we've done a few things over the course of the campaign to really hammer that home. During that mid-season break when we talked about stuff, one of the other players brought to the table this really cool system from another game they've played. I feel terrible. I cannot fly for me to remember it, but if I pick it up, we'll toss it into the description notes. But it was all about what do your characters want from each other that they can't get, and then the other person replies of why they can't give the other character what they want. So it's building those connections and those bonds, but also building in a little bit of kind of default conflict, a little bit of tension, a little bit of back and forth to help drive some of that role play.
Yeah, that's interesting. I'm actually in a campaign, a D&D campaign. This is probably the first one that I've had where the party has had really a kind of a deep conflict between a couple. There's like three of us that are kind of adventurers, and then there are two that ended up stealing some stuff from us, and so we kind of like captured them, and now they're kind of tagging along I'm not exactly sure why yet. We haven't really figured out why we're keeping them around, but it's been very interesting and very fun to have those like conflicts of some of the party members don't really like each other. And I know one of the players was like, as a player, I love this. As a character, I hate this. But it's just been really cool because it's a different experience for me, and having those conflicts has really changed. It changes the party dynamics, I think, in an interesting way. And there's a little bit more tension from session to session, even when there's not like things that are threatening us or whatever, right? Because there's just some social tension there. So baking that in
even just a little bit is kind of a neat way to get some of that, maybe a little bit more mild than what our party's dealing with. But it's always neat to have a little bit more social tension than just everybody is together in a group, working towards the same goal. So kind of neat.
Yeah, I agree, and I like the way you're describing it as well. It's even if you are still maybe working toward the same goal, you might all be going toward it for different reasons. And I really wanted to move away from that classic like bad trope of intra-party conflict of like the rogue steals everybody's magic items every night. Like that's to me that's just a toxic table presence and not actually like interesting conflict. It's just somebody who is being unpleasant actively. Whereas this is more about like, yeah, these are teenagers and they have, big feelings and sometimes they say dumb stuff and hurt people's feelings and then, don't want to admit fault and they grow as a person when they learn to type of stuff. So I was able to pull it up. It's a game called Hillfolk built on the drama system. And one of its, character creation elements is this, wants and needs. And we kind of adapted that in and pulled that in, and then our rebuilt connection system kind of flows around that. So the mechanics of the game now actively push your characters to have, again, not necessarily like a fight, but there's a difference in expectations. Maybe it's a hope that you have for that other person that they don't want to fulfill. Maybe it's something you're afraid is true about them that you're not sure about. Maybe it's a lie that you're telling them that you don't want them to know about. Or maybe it's just you're really upset with them. And whatever that conflict point is, anytime one of the moves in the game pushes your characters together, if you're aiding them, if you're figuring them out, if you're helping them through something, it's continually ticking forward that new renovated connection system. And whenever you get to that, turning point, the scene just shifts. The camera turns to the two of you and you have to talk it out. And you don't have to resolve it. You could just yell and come away equally unhappy, at which point we'll turn back the clock and try again later. But to make sure that stuff doesn't just simmer forever, because that's not something we want to see. We don't want to just see a character who was mean and the other characters are hurt and then we never get to resolve it. There's no payoff from that. It's just upsetting. So we wanted to make sure there was always some movement toward that payoff for these. We're liking how that's going. It's driving the plotting forward in a lot of cases. NPCs can get pulled into it too. We've definitely got at least a few will they won't they crush scenarios going on that are going to have to get answered sooner or later. I may have to build in a school dance. I don't know.
The way you're describing it does really remind me of like the superhero like cartoons and TV shows and stuff, and just those scenes where you focus on like two people and their relationship, even if it's just for a couple minutes. I mean, they have that tension build up, and then something happens, and then they have to talk about it, or they do something, right, or there's a fight or whatever. But I can kind of see, from how you're talking about it, that it is pushing that design towards the tropes that you want to, right, and tend to
reinforcing genre.
Yes, that's the word. Thank you.
And it's not to pretend that Fry and I have arrived at like a unique formulation there. Honestly, I'm ripping heavily off of Masks: A New Generation, which is like, to me, the like ultimate dramatic teen superheroes having emotions at each other game. And everything from their influence system, which is people who have influence over your like teenage character who doesn't know who they are yet, can shift your stats up and down like mid game. There's all those moves of like whenever you talk to somebody after a big fight about how you feel, if they approve of you, this mechanic fires. If they kind of don't approve of what you've done or kind of negative response to you, this mechanic fires. And the whole game is kind of built around that notion of those little emotional conflicts and those little pushes toward emotional growth. And whatever you do in Masks, the system is there to kind of support you and make sure that as long as you're playing into that genre, cool stuff happens in the game. And we definitely want to achieve something like that. In this one, like I said, if you have that blow up moment and you can't resolve it, the clock ticks back and you're going to find yourself there again. If you have a blow up moment and at least one person walks away happy, you're going to get to take forward some kind of resource or bonus. If both parties actually are pleased with how it went, you get an even bigger bonus because we want to encourage, that friendship. But you're not disadvantaged if you wind up walking straight into another conflict or question. That's just another opportunity to get XP and +1s, right?
But it is mechanically enforced. There is a incentive there for players to play out those scenes and to come to a resolution.
Yeah, exactly. And I think you see this in a lot of, what I consider like the best PbtA games. Built into the playbooks themselves, there's often one or more central character conflicts or challenges. Like I mentioned earlier, like I think Thirsty Sword Lesbians has a lot of great content around there. Like, the Beast feels like they're not a part of society. And so you kind of get to, through your moves and through your characters, like sort of special resources and stuff, you get to kind of move in a direction of either maybe becoming more accepted by society or feeling comfortable being and existing outside of it. And whenever you take advances, whenever you earn XP, it drives that narrative forward. Whenever you use your moves, it reinforces that narrative. This is something I think some people don't love about PbtA. They're like, well, I don't like the fact that the games seem to want you to play a certain kind of story. And absolutely, it would not be wise to like grab masks and try to run like a really grim, dark, supernatural horror game about adults who all get along easily. Like it just wouldn't work for that. But what it does really, really well.
Yeah, you're going from a more generic system into something that's a lot more specific in the tone and the style of game that you're trying to play. So I agree with that. It's really picking the right tool for the job and not if you want to play something more generic, then play something more generic, or write the PbtA game that hits that genre that you want to play, right?
Yeah. And maybe it's the case that genre is not the only thing you can build a PbtA game around, but I think most of the ones that I'm really fond of seem to choose that as their like central organizing element, and it works really well. Like I can't wait for Pasión de las Pasiones to come out from Brandon Leon Gambetta. It's the game of being in a classic like Latin American like telenovela soap opera show, and it's just all the crazy over the top drama and betrayals and lies, and if you're betraying somebody really good, take a bonus on this roll. Like it just leans into that genre and does well with it. The flip side of it, and I kind of talked about this a little bit earlier, with our session 0 and stuff, is I think if you're going to dive into a game like this that's really about conflict and emotions and young characters kind of going through the ringer sometimes, you really want to make sure that your game is also safe to play. So I like that you mentioned at your table a player outright said, I'm loving this, but my character hates it. Like to me, that's kind of the ideal scenario.
Yeah, and it was kind of funny when that situation came up too, because two of the players, that one and one of the other ones, were basically just slinging insults back and forth at each other, pretty rapid fire for almost probably a couple minutes. So I think just as a note to the GM, it was like, okay, they're getting along as players. And having fun with it, but the characters are not. And it was really fun to listen to, but then also good to know that it wasn't because they were actually upset or anything either, because the role playing was pretty high at that point, which was great. Made for a good session. What other kind of safety tools and stuff do you have, or that are you talking about in your game?
So we've drawn in the various games I run and play, we've drawn a lot from the RPG Safety Toolkit, which is an awesome resource and is kept up to date and has some really cool stuff in it. I think the basic stuff of like an X card, at this point is virtually just a baseline assumption. Anything I'm going to run, if the senior and if what's happening right now is making somebody uncomfortable, you can always toss that S card and we'll just stop the scene right there. And frequently, there's more sophisticated versions, that have maybe like let's go through it slowly. There's like the rewind card in some variations of this, of like, let's step back and redo it. Or, fade to black on this, of like, I'm okay with what's happened, but I kind of don't want to talk about it anymore. So you've got some systems that get a little bit more or less specific with it. But to me, the big things that you always want to have available are something to stop play when somebody's not feeling okay, and something that encourages you to check in and make sure that people are cool with what's happening in the so like I said, we had sort of a lines and veils and desires thing up front. So what are some things that you just absolutely never want to see in this kind of campaign? And again, there's excellent resources online of people who have drawn up really great lists of sort of the typical stuff there, whether it's like you really hate like really intense blood and gore, or you really hate bugs, or whatever the case may be. There's some good stuff there, versus Veils, which is more of a, I don't mind it existing in the game as long as we just don't focus on it a lot. Can we fade it to black? Can we, talk about it in general terms and not really dig into the nitty gritty details of exactly what that assassin is doing with his knife and my guts? But that also desires, like, what's the stuff that you want to see in the game? Do you want to see those kinds of emotional conflicts? So, we have a game where, there are a lot of emotional conflicts, but we don't necessarily want to have a lot of like gaslighting. Just, again, world being what it is, that's a particular kind of stress that some of us were like, we all agree that's bad. We don't need to have a villain in the game who's gaslighting our characters to prove it. It's just uncomfortable.
Yeah.
So I think things like that are great. If you're using Roll20 and you make a campaign, you can import into the game an RPG safety toolkit right away in Roll20. And I'm sure other VTTs probably have some similar packages you can grab. But that one has things like an X card and like a fast forward button and stuff. And that's just a deck of cards the players can deal out onto the play surface, just to make it really clear, and easy for the GM to know. When I've run things on Discord, I can say, hey, if you want to shoot me a DM because you don't want to publicly state to everyone you're uncomfortable, shoot me a DM on Discord. I've got it up on a monitor, and I'll monitor and I'll look for that. Some of it's going to be just talking to your players and seeing what works best for them. Some folks are really okay just raising their hand and being like, I think this is really weird and we should stop. And other people prefer like let's take a break every hour and just check in kind of thing.
Sure. I didn't realize that Roll20 had a safety toolkit on it. But that's always something that, at least in the last couple of games that we've done, that gets brought up just kind of at the session 0, and then really haven't had to talk much about it, which is great. But it is nice that they have some built-in stuff for VTTs, since that's the way that a lot of people are playing nowadays.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, certainly. I love the fact that I have a little like Ziploc baggie full of like X cards and line cards and stuff in my backpack. But having the digital option is great. I think in Roll20, it's whenever you create the campaign, you can like import content into the game, and that's just a piece of free content that's available to every GM on the platform. So you can tick a button and it'll show up there for you.
I will try to find a link to that and include that in the show notes.
And I mean, the overall goal is to make sure everybody is having a good time together, that we're telling stories that people enjoy telling. And if that involves characters fighting, like you said, as long as everybody at the table is cool with that and nobody is actually getting upset or uncomfortable, then, that's awesome. For my part, I find conflict terrifying. And if I myself am in a conflict, I get incredibly stressed out. But somehow, for whatever reason in my brain, it's totally okay to throw these other people's poor characters into the mixer of Magic Kid high school drama, and that's fine. That's happening to other people.
Do you want to jump into our next section, diving back into D&D?
Yeah, absolutely. Let's toss out all this like goofy story game nonsense. Let's talk about real dice and mechanics, right? And thank you for bringing that up. So I have joined on. I initially intended to be sort of a mercenary GM for some friends who were running a D&D campaign here in RTR. It's the second season of our big D&D SOP. It's in this cool custom world, the folks in season 1 made. It may surprise everybody to learn that out of all the systems we've offered an SOP for, the D&D one is by far the most popular. And they had a really overwhelming player demand and needed a little bit of extra support to run some more tables. So, I had some changes on my schedule. I had some free time. It's been, half a decade since I was running a D20 game, and I said, maybe I am finally ready to run some D&D again. Maybe I can accept that kind of stress back. And so I made the offer. They said that sounded great. I said, all right, cool. Well, the season starts in 2 months. And I said, cool. I have to learn how to run 5e. And mercifully, there's a lot of great content. For instance, there's several wonderful interviews here on the Dungeon Master's Toolkit podcast that go into some great ideas and tips there. But YouTube is full of people who will tell you all about how to run 5e. Some of whom are very shouty and enthusiastic, and some of whom are very chill and laid back, which is a little bit more my speed. Shout out Bob World Builder. I always enjoy your soothing, dulcet tones calmly explaining how to make weapons cooler. And I guess there's also some books that Wizards of the Coast sells that you can read, but that's like the lame way to learn how to learn, right? Much better to just watch a bunch of YouTube videos and then worry.
There definitely is a lot of content out for running D&D.
There is, and it's the biggest game system in the world, right? Like, obviously everybody wants to play it thanks to Critical Role and Stranger Things and all that stuff. And everybody's got a lot of ideas about how to play it. And I'm coming from a place where, growing up, I played some D&D here and there, and I ran a couple of like bad one shots in 3 and 4e, and then I swapped over to Pathfinder, for my first big long-term home game, which is D&D 3.51, right? It's very heavily based off of that and an evolution of those rules. And 5e has some similarities, but there's a lot of differences. There's little things of like, right, okay, attacks of opportunity are slightly different and flanking is slightly different, but it also simplifies a lot of things, which I'm a fan of, because what I've dealt with over the years, what I've kind of affectionately described as like post Pathfinder stress disorder. I don't know if you find this as a GM for games, but somewhere like around the 3-year mark of like digging through tomes of monsters and like applying archetypes and stuff to the monsters to make them party appropriate difficulty, and making sure the magic weapons weren't going to overbalance one person's build, and that this character had enough gold to use their crafting feats that they'd spent a bunch of resources to acquire, and then making sure that at any given point, nobody was accidentally doubling bonuses that weren't allowed to double, but were doubling the bonuses that were allowed to double. I just got burnt out. It's a lot.
There's a lot to keep track of. I think that's probably one of my complaints of running just D&D in general, is that there's just a lot of nitty-gritty things that you kind of have to balance, especially when, like we said, as it comes to monsters and stuff. It can be the line between an easy encounter and a total party kill can be somewhat thin sometimes, and I would rather just be like, okay, I'm going to have these monsters and this stuff, and I would like to just run it and not have to do as much prep as maybe is needed for D&D games.
Yeah, and in watching all that content and reading about it, I guess there's like 2 or 3 different systems for building encounters that Wizards has released at this point, because people found the first one too confusing or not accurate for their game. And I mean, that stuff is hard. You were talking previously about like unexpected interactions between characters. 5e maybe not as overboard as Pathfinder 1e got, but yeah, by the time you're 5th or 6th level and you toss out a few buffs and then a few character abilities and a couple of feats, the interactions can get wild. And this party of 5th level characters is wildly more or less capable of handling this kind of monster than that party of 5th level characters. It's a lot to track. The flip side is there's a lot of cool little like knobs to tweak and buttons to push, right? Like, there's all those awesome builds you can monkey around with, and cool abilities and legendary actions and layer actions, and combos of monsters, or go steal Matt Colville's action oriented monster design techniques. There's a lot of little things to play around with as a GM that I have to admit I had really missed as well.
And I think having maybe a wider array of mechanics and stuff as well can lead to sometimes easier designing things, because you just have more to go off of in terms of like examples and stuff like that. Thinking of just spells in D&D, there are so many spells. So if you wanted to make a spell or a monster ability or something, you can almost just look at your list of spells and then kind of know what level things are, and then tweak it or add it to an item or give it to a monster as needed, which can be a lot of fun. As a player, that's one of the things that I always think is really neat about like the Genesis system and the like the Edge of the Empire or the Star Wars Fantasy Flight system, because even like leveling up and stuff is just it's just a bunch of little bonuses and abilities that you can purchase kind of in any order. And then like weapon customization, vehicle customization. There's just a ton of stuff that you can do, which is really fun to dig into, and is also overwhelming as a game master. So
Definitely systems that benefit heavily from, I expect you to know how to run your character type GMing. Like I'm not here to operate your 11th level wizard for you. You should really know what your spells do.
Yes, I agree with that. And whenever I run those systems, I tend to be the one that's like answering all of the questions on how things work. And I think that's where my overload comes in. Because, yeah, trying to keep all of that straight is difficult. Whereas if I play like Dungeon World or something, like I pretty much know all of the rules and most of the moves that the playbooks have. So it's a lot quicker for me to troubleshoot issues or questions than it is in D&D or any of those other deeply customizable games.
Yeah, same deal. Like I run a ton of Fate, and at the end of the day, like I can figure out 17 different ways to make sure that I'm applying the correct +2 to this situation. But it's Fate, so I'm probably applying a +2 to the situation at the end of the day. Right? That's it's kind of core bonus mechanic. Yeah. It's the same deal though. With wanting to write and run a PbtA game is to stretch those GM muscles a little bit, and diving back into 5e, GMing it after playing it a lot, was same deal. It was like, all right, like I think there is cool stuff to be gleaned, from encounter design and having, I think 4e did that really well. The notion of like the minions who are there to like plink away at you and soak up hits, and the controller who makes sure the players can't move around too much, and the brute who's going to dish out a ton of damage, or the solo who has enough actions to keep up with a 4-player party and not get overwhelmed in the initiative count. And 5e has some little things like that. Again, like Matt Colville's new Kickstarter for Flea Mortals, his new monster book has a bunch more stuff like that. And I think that the lessons I'm learning here will be beneficial, in those other systems as well. Like I think having a broader base of experience can only really be helpful, and being able to make things cooler. And Fate's never going to do the stuff that D&D does exactly. It tells different kinds of stories, it runs a different kind of game, and has a different kind of feel. But there's some pretty cool traps that have been thought of over the 40 or 50 odd year history of D&D. I can probably thieve a few of those from an old adventure module and convert them and do some neat stuff that.
Yeah, I've always said that I think that one of the best ways to be a better DM, I guess, or even a player, but more so a DM, is to just read and or play in other game systems, because you just learn so much about what other game systems are good at, and then maybe what that your favored game systems might be really good at specific things, and you maybe just didn't know that, and you might find some blind spots that they have, because there's no game that's perfect for everything. So and being able to pull those pieces into your campaign to tweak it the way you like it is always good. But you won't know that it exists unless you go out and read it or play it or hear about it.
I fundamentally agree. Last time we talked a little bit about like fail forward designs, which is obviously a really key piece of PbtA and Fate alike. A role that is just a binary pass fail can lead to some boring or problematic outcomes. If players need clue X to proceed and they fail the investigate check to find it, what is your session going to do now? So I love games that have like success tiers or fail forward or something that'll drag you forward, kind of regardless of the result of your roll. And I think applying things like that into D&D is only going to make the games smoother and cooler. It doesn't just have to be like, oh yeah, you crit failed an attack roll, or you got a 1 on an ability check, which I know isn't technically a critical, but we all love to flavor it because it's funny that way. You can have more than 1 fail, pass, and 20. You can flavor things up a little bit more. You can add some options or some branching paths to how the session might go. You can give people a little bit of extra info on a higher roll, or offer them a devil's bargain if they're not quite to the number they need. I love stuff like that in other games. And, I'm not going to do it on every roll in a D&D game. Obviously, D&D has its balance and its intended way to play. But having that stuff in my back pocket is awesome for a particular scene.
Yeah, I think especially in D&D, I think that people or DMs try to do that subconsciously. I think that knowing that those are options that you can give to your players is a good way just to be aware of it, because before playing like Dungeon World, I wouldn't have really known to do some of those things with like the partial successes. But like you said, in a D&D game, if you do something like an investigation check and then they have something that's plot critical for them to find and they don't see it, then you just kind of stalls your game out. Whereas sometimes, I know one of the biggest tips that I've seen is having a failure be a success that they didn't want. Is a good way to force the narrative forward sometimes when maybe you shouldn't have had them roll or something. Like they fail to, pick the lock on a door or something, and instead of it being locked, the door clicks open weirdly easily, and they open the door and there's a bunch of guards looking at you or something, right? So it's still a failure. It's also still a success, but the situation got worse. So, and that stuff is all, mechanic independent. You can just kind of work that in, regardless of what system you're using, though with like PbtA and Forged in the Dark games as well. It's kind of built into the dice rolling mechanics, so it's a little bit more top of mind than it is in a D&D game.
Yeah, I agree. Although, in working on Hope on Cosmica and talking to my friends about it, one person pointed out that they really don't care for that element in PbtA because it feels to him like it's very player oppositional. Like the system is almost wanting you to fail in order to drive the mechanics. And part of that I realized was in how I was portraying some of those mixed successes and blunders and stuff. I think there's a lot to be said for letting the characters be awesome and not undercutting their success on that mixed success. Present a new problem, maybe even a related problem, but don't kind of like punish them for doing the cool thing every single time. And that's a tweak in my brain I had to make. Whenever I'm having to improv on the spot of what an appropriate downside to a mixed success is, just playing off of exactly what they were trying to do is the easy place for my brain to go. It's a little bit harder for me to remember to do things like do a cutscene to like an enemy plotting something dark in the distance, or put some, while you are successfully achieving your task, the enemy uses your distraction to endanger some innocence. Those kinds of GM moves in those systems. Let the player have their win and feel cool. While still providing that next dramatic step like you're talking about.
I think one of the nice things about a lot of PbtA games, or at least Dungeon World, a lot of moves have some of that built in where it will give the player the choice of what bad thing happens. And that's nice to offload that from, that decision from you. And I think a lot of times in Dungeon World, it'll be like, they give you like two options, and then, or, the GM will give you something too. So if they don't want it, either of the two options that they have, they can always toss it back to you. But a lot of times they don't want to take the risk of tossing it back to you, so they'll pick what they want.
Yeah, very agreed on. Yeah, I don't know. It's one of those little curiosities of design that's been a lot of fun to play around with that stuff. And I think, like I said, it's teaching me more. And so in some ways, I'm kind of glad that I've got this PbtA thought process running simultaneously with this like learning 5e thought process. I think it's going to provide some really cool fertile ground for original stuff in kind of both worlds. So I don't know. Yeah, back to your point, GMs and DMs out there, play and read more systems. It'll only make you better at what you do.
And I think it's probably a good time to jump into your last section that we have here, which is making the most of GenCon.
Yeah, if I've got a third RPG track spinning in my brain right now, it's Gen Con. A few friends and I are gonna, chance it and go back out in person this year. We're a group that's been going, together for a few years now. So I'll state up front, kind of like the PbtA thing. I am not a all-seeing, all-knowing expert, but I'd like to, as a relatively recent convertee to large RPG cons, share the little bits of things I've learned to try to make it fun for folks. So actually, first question to you: have you ever gotten to go out to a RPG con of any kind?
I haven't. I would like to, but I have not. So
They come in all shapes and sizes, right? I've had a friend who was just at Gary Con, which seems tiny. I've got some friends every year who go to Dragon Con, which is huge in a very different way, insofar as just one hotel just crammed, to the rafters with people in awesome cosplay. And then Gen Con is, the best 4 days in gaming, they say, right? So there's a ton of gaming available. And what's worked well for us is kind of a weird amount of planning to try to maximize the fun that we extract from every second of our Gen Con experience. So, weird thought, a bunch of RPG nerds are min-maxing their nerdy activity. Huh.
that's great.
But it's one of those things of like you can min-max so many different parts of it. There's a hotel lottery. There aren't enough hotel rooms in downtown Indianapolis to hold everybody who wants to come. So each person who buys a ticket gets a slot in the hotel lottery, randomly assigned time on hotel day that they can log into the hotel system and book a room. Earlier you log in, the better rooms are available. If everybody buys their own ticket and you're going in a group of 8 people, that's 8 chances to roll high on the lottery. Downside is you also need enough hotel space for 8 people. So there's some like logistical breakpoints of like about every 4 people, give or take, is probably a good place to aim for, to have that good interplay between best shots at getting a hotel room versus not needing too many beds to sleep on. So we min-maxed the heck out of that. We're min-maxing our schedules every single day. With Gen Con, there's a similar, not quite lottery, but there's the event signups go live day. They'll have the event catalog available, and that's actually coming up in about a month in May. And there's events, RPG tables, obviously, of course, thousands of those, but they have workshops on making chainmail, and they have seminars on game design, and they have, cosplay live action chess battles, and they have LARPs, and the Gen Con dance, and they have movie showings and all that stuff, and all of it's put into this giant schedule that basically runs from like about 8 a.m. to about midnight every day. So you can put into a wish list all the events you want to get into, and whenever the event system goes live, you kind of hit the go button on your wish list, and it'll sign you up for as many of those as there are openings for. So it's another one of those click the button as fast as you can things. So we are all definitely like stacking our wish list order to ensure that if the first 5 things we want fail out, we've still got 4 more things in line behind them to go into those same time slots. So I am definitely doing like 8 a.m. to midnight schedules of like 3 or 4 games with like 30-minute gaps for food, intermittently spaced throughout. Because I figure if I'm, spending $100+ on this ticket, and I'm driving out to Indianapolis and cramming myself into a hotel room with a bunch of other nerds, I want to extract as much gaming as possible from that. So min-max your schedule while you're there.
You're already there. You might as well get into some events.
Right. And of course, again, that's what works best for us. There's other folks who like want to have that 4-hour space to just wander the enormous vendor hall. I'm sure somebody in comments is going to sound off. 4 hours is not nearly enough to wander the vendor hall. So leave yourself the gaps where you want to have them. Certainly. Another little nice bit of min-maxing Gen Con advice I've got. They will give you a free Gen Con ticket if you run. I want to say it's 70 player hours worth of event, I think is the number. I can't remember off the top of my head. I apologize. But what I'll tell you is this works out to, if you run 3 RPG sessions that run 4 hours for 6 players each, you will hit the required number of player hours, in time that people are spending at your event. to get your free GenCon pass, because about every event is billed at like $2 an hour paid to GenCon. So, if you are earning them enough money with stuff that you run, you get a free pass to the whole con. Running 3-4 hour events in a 4-day weekend is not a ton of time. So, if you've got that cool one shot that you ran for your buddies back home, or you really are fond of this adventure thing that you bought in a Kickstarter that you've never gotten to run, submit it to Gen Con and get your free ticket. If you're lucky enough to be able to run giant events like LARPs, you can even get free hotel rooms from Gen Con just for running stuff for them.
That's awesome. I wasn't aware of that. And yeah, if you're running 3 sessions, it's not like you need to have 3 different things, because you're going to be running for different people every time. So you can just run the same one shot 3 times. And honestly, 4 hours isn't. I mean, if you're making characters too at the beginning quick, then 4 hours isn't really that long of a session.
Yeah.
If it takes people a half an hour, depends on what you're running. If you're running D&D, it might take a little longer to make characters, but a lot of the PbtA games, you can have characters up and running in 10-20 minutes with rule explanations.
Yeah, I mean, honestly, the best game of Masks I've played was run by a friend, Ivan, at Gen Con, and we built out characters, developed our entire high school class and like the mechanics of our prom in the first like half hour, and then had an awesome session about fighting the bad guys so we can make it back in time for prom. The back 3 hours of the game, it was great. I'll also just state, for the record, it's important to note, drink water at Gen Con so you don't pass out and die. Bring, good deodorant so that you don't make everybody else really sad. And you're probably going to want to bring some money, because that vendor hall is really kind of extraordinary. But if you are min-maxing like I have done, and cramming as many people into the most gas-efficient car that your friend group has, do remember that there is a physical limitation on the number of board games you as a group can purchase and physically bring home with you. Or have somebody in the group who's really good at Tetris.
Bring some boxes for shipping all your stuff back.
There are vendors at the hall who will absolutely offer to ship stuff to your house for you.
I suppose you could almost just place an order with them, and then they just throw it in their system and ship it out.
I'm thinking of, I think it's an old Monty Cook game. Well, not that old, but I think it's called like Invisible Suns or something like that. And at one point they had like the super premiere edition of it. It was like this giant black cube filled with all these different playbooks and decks and dice, and then this giant like bronze hand that would sit in the center of the table. And they were like, yeah, if you are actually spending the $400 to buy this ridiculous box set, we'll just ship it to your house. Like, don't try to take this on a plane home with you. I think the TSA is not going to like what they see inside.
Yeah, I need to check this giant black box, please. Thanks.
Yeah, don't worry about it. It's fine. But I don't know. Yeah, I mean, what I obviously say is spend a little bit of time ahead of the con thinking about what you want to do, what kinds of things you enjoy. Look through that giant event catalog, which is super searchable. You can narrow things down super easily by time or game system or event type. And just, fill your schedule up with stuff that sounds cool to you. And then the last little thing I would say on it is this is an opportunity to experience the real width and breadth of gaming out there. Like, yeah, Baldman Games and Paizo are going to run, 3,000 sessions of 5e and Pathfinder 2e, but you can probably play that at home. Like, take some time and go play some weird indie game, or play test a new game from a developer you like and get to like meet them and shake their hand, or go to a film festival for something you've never experienced before, or, go to a seminar and learn how to make cool chainmail as a table prop for your next game. Like, there are, at least in past years, 60,000 awesome nerds there who have all brought their individual expertise and ideas and opinions. Go out there and like broaden your nerdy mind. There is so much cool stuff at Gen Con.
Well, now I want to plan another vacation so that I can go to Gen Con. So thanks for that.
You're welcome. Always glad to help.
Awesome.
Yeah.
Well, lots of good tips here on this episode. I think it's probably a good time to wrap it up. Randy, where can we find you?
Yeah, so check me out on Twitter at Party of Bards. As I mentioned at the end of the last episode, the hope is to eventually spin up some video content under the Learn to RPG banner. But that's been kicked back and delayed a little bit. Turns out designing and GMing multiple campaigns simultaneously consumes a lot of time on top of like theoretically having a full-time job I get paid for. But yeah, keep an eye out on Twitter for more news on that front. And hopefully we'll see some more cool stuff coming out from me. In the interim, there's a ton of cool stuff right here on Dungeon Master's Toolkit. Gosh, how many episodes are you up to at this point?
This is 44.
Come up on the big 5-0. That's a lot of hours of awesome content, folks. So, click here.
Well, Randy, thank you for joining me today.
Thank you for having me.
It was a blast to have you on again.
Likewise, it was a great time being here. Thank you so much.
Thanks for listening to this week's episode of the Dungeon Master's Toolkit podcast. You can find links to all of the products and resources that we talked about on the show in the show notes. And if you'd like to join the community or find out how to be on the show, check out our subreddit or join us in our Discord server.